I was in a 2-day evidentiary hearing and I accepted the judge's rulings.
BJ Penn finds himself back in court facing a substantial sentence, and for those who've tracked his recent trajectory, this development carries an air of inevitability. His arrest record has grown extensively in recent years, spanning family disputes to assault allegations, yet this current situation feels markedly different. The accumulation of incidents appears to have reached a critical mass, potentially resulting in his extended absence from public life. What transpired to bring him to this juncture? Let's examine the details. The courtroom became the epicenter of his unraveling on March 2, 2026, when BJ Penn appeared before the High-Low Circuit Court for proceedings connected to numerous misdemeanor charges, including family abuse and restraining order violations. However, the entire case had stalled over a singular issue that had now assumed central importance: a mental health evaluation. From the hearing's outset, complications were apparent. Rather than proceeding with the evaluation, his defense team mounted opposition. His lawyers submitted a motion requesting the court reconsider or suspend the state-mandated mental health examination, contending that a previous voluntary assessment had already established his mental fitness. Superficially, this argument holds merit. If an individual has already undergone evaluation and been deemed mentally competent, repetition seems unnecessary. The prosecution viewed the matter differently. They maintained that the earlier evaluation proved insufficient, lacked thoroughness, and relied excessively on Penn's personal statements without independent corroboration. This distinction between self-reported information and externally verified data became the pivotal element of the entire hearing. From the court's standpoint, this transcended mere procedural compliance. It concerned certainty, which requires more than telephone conversations or self-assessments. The judge carefully considered both positions before rendering a decision that would shape all subsequent proceedings. He rejected the motion. Judge Peter Kubota dismissed the request to suspend the evaluation and mandated Penn complete the state-ordered mental health examination. While this alone would have advanced the case, what followed added considerable gravity to the moment. The judge exceeded merely restating the order by issuing a direct warning. He cautioned that continued refusal or delays regarding the evaluation would prompt the court to pursue contempt proceedings, potentially resulting in incarceration. This transformed the entire dynamic, shifting focus from simple compliance to tangible, immediate consequences that wouldn't await trial commencement. Penn's response reveals much about his perspective, not merely through actions but through tone, language, and how he frames these events. To him, this evaluation represented more than procedural necessity. It was something fundamentally different. He resisted the requirement, questioned its purpose, and crucially, questioned its ramifications. In his view, this transcended legal process to encompass reputation, income, and identity. He argued the mental health evaluation could tarnish his public image and compromise his earning potential through appearances tied to his name. This reveals the disconnect more clearly. While the court focuses on competency, whether he comprehends the proceedings and can assist in his defense, Penn concentrates on external appearances and implications for his identity outside that courtroom. These priorities neither align nor overlap.
2 weeks before you made the decision for me to do a mental health exam, I was in a 2-day evidentiary hearing.
This moment encapsulates something nuanced yet significant. Not mere disagreement, but bewilderment about why the situation has reached this level of escalation. From his viewpoint, he had already engaged in proceedings and complied with previous rulings, so the sudden questioning of his mental state seemed inexplicable. The explanation, though not explicitly stated then, had been developing for months. This March hearing didn't occur in isolation. It resulted from everything preceding it: overlooked evaluations, continued violations, and intensifying assertions. In December 2025, Penn had been scheduled for his initial court-mandated mental evaluation but failed to appear. He missed the first mental health examination scheduled for late December 2025, contributing to case delays. Upon returning to court in January 2026, he didn't simply acknowledge the absence and proceed, he contested it.
Former UFC superstar BJ Penn claims he was never told about his appointment for a court-ordered mental exam.
Penn maintained the failure to appear wasn't his responsibility, instead blaming his attorney and claiming he was never properly notified of the appointment. He stated he hadn't been informed of the evaluation date and only discovered it indirectly through court documents reviewed by a third party. This assertion introduced another layer of courtroom tension, expanding the focus beyond the evaluation to encompass representation, communication, and trust. Penn escalated further, filing motions to replace his attorney, remove the judge, and challenge the case's entire framework. Collectively examining these elements, the missed evaluation, blame assigned to counsel, attempts to remove both attorney and judge, reveals a pattern extending beyond standard legal strategy. It appears to be resistance to the complete process. This resistance is precisely what the court aims to evaluate, because from a legal perspective, repeated noncompliance raises a fundamental question: is the defendant refusing cooperation or unable to cooperate? This question sits at the heart of everything, because if the answer is refusal, the court can proceed with penalties. However, if the answer is inability, if genuine questions exist about mental fitness, then the court has an obligation to pause, assess, and ensure the person standing trial actually comprehends what's occurring. This is why the evaluation isn't optional but foundational, and why Judge Kubota's warning carries such weight. It signals the court will no longer negotiate on this point. The evaluation will occur regardless, and if it doesn't, consequences will begin immediately rather than waiting for trial commencement. This makes the March 2026 hearing so crucial. It's not merely another calendar date, but the moment when the case stops drifting and begins focusing, when the court establishes boundaries and options become clear: comply or face contempt, move forward or be compelled to do so. The situation grows more tense considering everything simultaneously occurring outside the courtroom, because while legal proceedings unfold, the narrative surrounding Penn continues expanding: claims about imposters, public statements, a version of reality misaligned with courtroom presentations. He has consistently claimed family members, including his mother, have been replaced by imposters attempting to control family assets. This belief isn't background noise but central to understanding, because if this is his operational framework, then every legal order, restriction, and accusation gets interpreted through this lens, making compliance not just difficult, but potentially impossible. You cannot agree with a system built on a reality you reject. This is the tension defining the entire case, not just what occurred, but how it's understood. As the hearing concludes, there's no resolution or final determination of guilt or innocence, just a directive: complete the evaluation and return to court. He was ordered to undergo the mental health examination and return to court on May 13, 2026, with results. That date becomes the next focal point, because everything now depends on what transpires between those two moments: whether he complies, whether the evaluation is completed, whether results confirm or challenge the court's suspicions. As of that March hearing, one thing is clear: the case is no longer solely about his actions, but about whether he understands what's happening to him. Until that question is answered, nothing else advances. Not the charges, trial, or outcome, just waiting and mounting pressure regarding what happens if the court's established line is crossed again.
UFC Hall of Famer BJ Penn was back in court today in Hilo. Penn was arrested twice over the Memorial Day weekend, accused of assaulting his 79-year-old mother.
Before court warnings, motions, and the gradual collision between resistance and consequence, a pattern was already forming. To understand why the court eventually drew a hard line, you must step back and examine who BJ Penn was, and more importantly, what he had become in the years leading to 2026. This isn't simply the story of a man appearing in court, it's about a legendary figure whose identity was built on dominance, discipline, and control, gradually becoming associated with something far less stable, predictable, and more concerning. BJ Penn wasn't just another fighter passing through the UFC, he was, at one point, the embodiment of raw, almost supernatural talent, earning the nickname the Prodigy, because he achieved things faster than anyone thought possible. He became the first non-Brazilian to win the IBJJF World Championship at black belt level, and went on to become a two-division UFC champion, capturing titles in both lightweight and welterweight divisions. In an era when moving between weight classes was rare and often unsuccessful, Penn didn't just attempt it, he made it look achievable. His legacy wasn't built on hype, but on moments, victories, and a reputation that made his name carry weight far beyond the cage. Yet by 2025's arrival, that same name began appearing in headlines for reasons completely unrelated to fighting. This shift didn't happen suddenly, but unfolded through a sequence of events that quickly stopped resembling coincidence and started forming an unbreakable pattern.
Prosecutors say he violated the temporary restraining order against him by coming within 100 yards of their home.
What commenced in May 2025 initially appeared to be a domestic dispute, the type of situation that, while serious, still fits a recognizable category. However, the incident's details immediately suggested something more complex was developing beneath the surface. On May 25, 2025, Penn was arrested for abuse of a family or household member following an alleged confrontation with his mother, with specifics including claims that he had taken mail from her mailbox, shined a bright flashlight into her eyes when confronted, and physically grabbed and shoved her. This created an image already difficult to reconcile with the composed, disciplined champion people remembered. More revealing than the incident itself was what followed, because before time existed for de-escalation or meaningful separation between him and the triggering environment, the pattern immediately repeated. On May 26, 2025, he was arrested again for violating a stay-away order issued after the initial incident, and this rapid recurrence transforms the narrative from a single event into something cyclical. A stay-away order is designed to create distance, both physically and legally, but in this case, that distance never materialized. Instead, the system found itself responding to the same situation twice within a 24-hour window. This is where the story begins shifting, because repetition at that speed suggests whatever drives the behavior isn't being interrupted by consequences in the normal way. This observation becomes even more significant when the pattern continues expanding beyond those first two arrests. Within days, the situation extended into the legal process itself. Around May 30, 2025, Penn was arrested for a third time after failing to appear in court, leading to a bench warrant, and this moment is critical because it demonstrates the pattern is no longer confined to interpersonal conflict, but now includes disengagement from the system, attempting to resolve that conflict. Missing a court date in isolation might be explainable, but within the context of consecutive arrests and escalating legal pressure, it becomes part of a larger sequence suggesting something more fundamental is misaligned. The cycle persisted into June. On June 12, 2025, he was arrested again for violating the temporary restraining order, and by this point the pattern structure was firmly established. A boundary is set, that boundary is crossed, and the consequence leads not to adjustment, but to repetition. The court, recognizing this, escalated its response by formalizing those boundaries into something more durable. In August 2025, a one-year protection order was granted, prohibiting contact with his mother and restricting his property access, intended to stabilize the situation by introducing long-term consequences for further violations. However, even this didn't end the pattern.
I don't give a what you're turning graph. I get half holy too. You're not the only holy here. We all niggas. We all niggas, you fucking dummy.
By September, identical behavior resurfaced. On September 15, 2025, Penn was arrested for the fifth time after entering his mother's property in violation of the active protection order. At this stage, the repetition becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence or temporary instability. The same location, same restriction, and same outcome. Eventually, the situation stops being contained within reports, filings, and courtroom summaries, spilling into something raw, unfiltered, showing how this behavior looks when no longer interpreted, but simply captured.
He has this thought in his mind that someone kidnapped and replaced his family and is coming after.
That moment matters not because of the words alone, but because of what it represents. It's no longer structured or filtered through legal language or courtroom procedure. It's direct, emotional, chaotic, showing a side of the situation that paperwork only hints at. When placed alongside the arrests, violations, and repeated returns to restricted spaces, it stops looking like isolated incidents and starts resembling a continuous state of escalation that doesn't fully reset between encounters. What complicates this pattern further is that it doesn't remain confined to the family dispute, because in November, the situation expands outward entirely. On November 4, 2025, Penn was arrested for third-degree assault after allegedly punching and kicking a 45-year-old man in Hilo, introducing a separate incident not directly tied to his mother or the restraining order. Yet when viewed alongside previous arrests, it doesn't feel disconnected but like an extension of the same instability, manifesting in a different environment under different circumstances while following the same underlying trajectory. By 2025's end, these incidents' accumulation forms a timeline difficult to ignore. He had been arrested at least 6 times within the year, facing multiple misdemeanor charges including domestic abuse, restraining order violations, and assault, and those numbers, while significant, only tell part of the story. Because running parallel to these arrests, informing them, shaping them, and perhaps driving them, is a belief appearing consistently across both court filings and public statements.
Former UFC superstar BJ Penn claims he was never told about his appointment for a court-ordered mental exam.
He repeatedly claimed that his family members, including his mother, had been replaced by imposters attempting to take control of family assets, and this belief isn't a minor detail, but the lens through which the entire pattern must be understood. If someone genuinely believes the people around them aren't who they claim to be, then actions appearing irrational from outside begin following different internal logic. Returning to a house you're legally barred from may not feel like violation if you don't accept the legitimacy of the person enforcing that boundary, and confronting someone identified as family may not feel like conflict if you believe that identity itself is false. This makes the situation so difficult for the legal system to resolve, because the system is built on shared reality, on the assumption that all parties involved agree at a basic level on what's happening. But in this case, that agreement doesn't fully exist, and without it, every intervention becomes less effective. Arrests don't interrupt the pattern as they normally would, restraining orders don't create intended distance, and court appearances don't produce the compliance that would allow clean case progression. Instead, everything loops back into the same structure: violation, arrest, release, and return. As this loop continues, the case's focus begins shifting away from individual incidents towards something more fundamental, not just what happened, but why it keeps happening. When behavior repeats this consistently despite escalating consequences, the legal system reaches a point where it can no longer treat each incident as separate, and instead must step back and ask a broader question, reframing the entire situation, not how to punish the pattern, but how to understand it. Once that shift happens, the next step becomes inevitable. He was ordered to undergo a mental health evaluation to determine whether he was fit to stand trial and able to understand the proceedings, as a direct response to everything that came before it: the arrests, violations, consistency of claims, and the fact that none of it appears to be slowing down. At some point, the pattern itself becomes evidence that something deeper needs examination, and once that happens, the case is no longer just about accountability, but about comprehension. By the time everything circles back to the courtroom, the story no longer concerns whether something happened. That question has been buried under months of arrests, violations, and repeated returns to the same conflict. Instead, the focus narrows to something far more specific, consequential, and uncomfortable to confront: whether BJ Penn is even capable of standing trial in the first place, and what happens if the answer isn't as straightforward as the legal system requires. After everything that unfolded throughout 2025, the repeated arrests, protection orders, and expanding behavioral pattern, the case doesn't advance to trial but pauses completely for one reason: the mental health evaluation now sitting at everything's center. By late 2025, the court had ordered a mental health evaluation to determine Penn's fitness to stand trial, and his ability to understand the proceedings against him. This decision isn't merely procedural, but foundational. Without that evaluation, nothing else can progress. Not the charges, arguments, or outcome. It becomes the gatekeeper of the entire case. Yet despite its critical nature, this is where the story becomes most unstable, because instead of compliance moving the process forward, the evaluation itself becomes the next resistance point, being delayed, missed, challenged, and ultimately transformed into the case's central conflict. That moment, simple on the surface, captures the beginning of a breakdown extending far beyond scheduling. When the evaluation is first missed in late 2025, it doesn't just delay the process but introduces doubt into the case's surrounding structure. Communication between Penn and his attorney is questioned, responsibility becomes unclear, and instead of the evaluation proceeding as planned, the case begins stalling in a way that feels less like a pause and more like a standstill. He stated he hadn't been informed of the evaluation and blamed his attorney for the miscommunication. From that point forward, the situation no longer moves cleanly, because what should have been a single step becomes multiple steps: rescheduling, motions, arguments, attempts to halt the process entirely. By early 2026, when the case returns to court, the evaluation is no longer just a requirement, but the central point of contention. His statement reveals not just frustration, but a fundamental disconnect. From Penn's perspective, he had already participated in the process, complied with prior proceedings, and demonstrated system engagement. So the sudden shift toward questioning his mental fitness doesn't feel like natural progression, but like an escalation he doesn't fully accept. From the court's perspective, that escalation is exactly what the pattern demands, because the evaluation isn't based on a single moment, but on accumulation: the arrests, repeated violations, and consistency of the belief that his family had been replaced by imposters. The court's concerns about Penn's mental state were tied to repeated claims that his family members were imposters, cited in filings and public statements. This makes this moment so critical, because the court isn't asking whether those beliefs are true, but whether they affect his ability to understand reality in a legal context. That distinction determines everything that follows. When the case reaches the March 2, 2026 hearing, the situation has narrowed to a single issue: whether the evaluation will happen. The defense attempts one final shift, arguing it doesn't need to occur, and claiming a prior voluntary mental health evaluation found no disorder and should replace the state-ordered exam. The prosecution immediately rejects this argument, stating the prior evaluation was incomplete, based largely on self-reporting, conducted without full context, and lacking independent verification required for something as significant as determining fitness for trial. When the judge agrees, the motion is denied, the evaluation stands, and then comes the moment reframing the entire situation, not as delay or disagreement, but as a turning point, a warning. Judge Kubota warned that if Penn refused to comply with the court-ordered evaluation, he could face contempt proceedings and possible jail time. This is where everything shifts, because until that point, consequences had been tied to the past: arrests, charges, violations. But now consequences are tied to the present, to compliance and what happens next. This makes this part of the story feel like a crossroads, rather than continuation, because from here the path splits. If the evaluation is completed and Penn is found fit to stand trial, the case moves forward in a familiar direction, with evidence presented, charges argued, and outcomes determined within the legal system structure. But if the evaluation reaches a different conclusion, if he's found unfit, then the case stops again for a completely different reason. If Penn is deemed unfit to stand trial, he could be committed to a state facility, such as Hawaii State Hospital, until competency is restored. This possibility gives the entire situation its weight, because for someone whose identity has been built on control, on being able to impose his will, dictate outcomes, and operate on his own terms, the idea of being removed from that control, even temporarily, represents something far more significant than any charge or sentence. It represents loss of autonomy, something the legal system doesn't negotiate around but enforces. The hearing concludes with no resolution, verdict, or sentence, just a directive. He was ordered to complete the mental health evaluation and return to court on May 13, 2026, with results. That date becomes everything's focal point, because it's no longer just another court appearance, but the moment when the system decides how to proceed, not based on what happened in 2025, but on what the evaluation reveals in 2026. This is where the title BJ, Penn Sentence Goodbye Forever, takes on different meaning. As of now, there's no final sentence or confirmed outcome. As of March 2026, the case remains unresolved with all charges pending mental health evaluation results, meaning the goodbye in that title isn't necessarily about a prison sentence, but could be about something else entirely: the end of a public identity, the end of control, the end of the version of BJ Penn people once recognized. Sometimes the most definitive endings don't come from a judge's ruling, but from a shift in reality that cannot be reversed. As everything now points toward May 13th, the question is no longer whether the story will end, but how, through trial, through treatment, or through something in between that leaves the outcome as uncertain as the path that led there. Until that moment arrives, the case remains suspended, not resolved, not dismissed, but held in place by a single unanswered question, not what he did, but whether he fully understands what's happening to him. That answer determines everything, and without it, there's no ending, only waiting.